Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with a deck overview for mono red fires in Pioneer. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative deck guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, give us a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below, especially what deck you might like to see us cover next, as we are running low on new archetypes to cover as far as these deck overviews. So mono red fires is obviously a Fires of Invention variant built around the card, allows you to cast 2 free spells per turn based on the number of lands you have in play. Generally, you want to have lands that also have utility to them to allow you to take advantage of this free mana each turn. Most of these decks tend to top out at 4 and 5 mana. Obviously, the 2 main ones in the format being Enigmatic Fires and Karuga Fires. Mono Red Fires is probably more similar to Karuga Fires than anything else, although obviously it has the mono red twist to it. So you're mainly drawing from red and colorless threats. The big thing around this deck is the inclusion of things like Darksteel Citadel and Cascading Cataracts as indestructible lands. The reason this is important is the card Cleansing Wildfire. It says destroy target land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield, tap, and shuffle, draw a card. If you happen to target an indestructible land, this effectively accelerates you by 1 land and also allows you to cantrip, while also having utility against some of the greedier mana bases in the format, potentially running them out of basics and kind of stifling their ability to cast spells, though this is mainly to accelerate you into your faster plays. One of the huge problems with the Fires of Invention deck is the lack of early plays usually. Especially Karuga Fires in particular, is vulnerable to really only having something like the adventure creatures to do on early turns, and mono red variants are not really much of an exception outside of Cleansing Wildfire. This particular build is using Spikefield Hazard as a modal phase card, so both a tap land and early interaction for things like your opponent's elves or early creatures out of humans. But beyond that, your early interaction starts with Bonecrusher Giant's Stomp, and then you're using things like Anger of the Gods and Fable of the Mirror Breaker to bridge you into your 4-drops. Bonecrusher Giant obviously is a nice threat. It's kind of one of the staple removal spells in the format while being one of the staple creatures for red decks. Fable kind of ties all these red mid-range piles together, allowing you to pitch extra lands if you happen to have them, or pitch spells to draw lands if you're running a little bit low on mana, etc. Then, obviously, Anger of the Gods is a very good removal spell on turn 3 to kind of stabilize you against aggressive decks like humans and spirits. So at the 4-drop slot, obviously you have Fires of Invention, kind of the cornerstone of the deck. The other thing a lot of these versions have is a Karn the Great Creator package. Now this is not quite as powerful as it is in mono green, as obviously mono green has access to a boatload of mana, so they're able to play the more powerful spells a little bit easier, but nevertheless it is nice having a Karn package against a lot of the decks that might otherwise give you problems. Other 4-drops that see play, Chandra Torch of Defiance. This is a very powerful planeswalker that kind of gets pushed to the side as more and more planeswalkers get printed, but it still is very powerful. Its card advantage, its mana boost, its removal, and its loyalty, or its ultimate can win the game in very short order if your opponent can't interact with it. Thought-Knot Seer, card not really seen much play in the Pioneer format, as it doesn't have Eldrazi Temple to really break it. However, a 4-mana 4/4 that allows you to take a card from your opponent's hand, generally pretty powerful, although obviously the drawback of when it dies, or actually leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. Now there is no ways to really abuse that in this deck, there's no Eldrazi Displacers or anything, but still a nice way to potentially clear the way for the rest of your deck to do its thing. And then finally, the top end, most of these lists are running Cavalier of Flame, a card that sees quite a bit of play in the Karuga Fires lists, especially when you have Fires of Invention in play. This allows you to kind of reset your hand while also threatening to kill your opponent out of nowhere, especially if they have no interaction up or they don't have much of a board presence, say they've attacked you for a bunch. If you have Fires of Invention in play, you can easily go something like Bonecrusher Giant, play Cavalier of Thorns, and then say you have a Fable of the Mirror Breaker flipped over. You can easily kill your opponent from 20 plus damage out of nowhere. One of the upsides to this deck, and obviously this is another way to recycle a bunch of lands or extra Fires of Invention in your hands to get some actual playable cards. One of Light Up the Night as an additional removal spell can also use your Planeswalkers as a little bit of leverage in the mid game to flashback, potentially kill your opponent for a very low life total. And then land-based, we've already kind of talked about Cascading Cataracts, Darksteel Citadel with their role in the deck is. This version also gets to play a copy of Blast Zone, potentially remove problematic things your opponent's casting, while also enabling you to cast your Thought-Knot Seers. Den the Bugbear, very nice mainland to have access to in these red decks. Field of Ruin kind of pairs with your Cleansing Wildfire plan. You kind of have this backup plan of blowing up all your opponent's lands, keeping them from casting spells. Ramonette Ruins is a way to have a little bit of extra reach while also having red and colorless mana for your Thought-Knot Seers and red spells. And then Sekenzan, always a nice one of utility in these red-based decks. Now, obviously, this deck having a Karn package means it doesn't really have a ton of sideboard cards. You basically have access to another copy of Anger of the Gods for creature-based matchups, Fry and Running Volley for things like Spirits, Angels, and the various Abzan Greasefang lists running around. Fry can also come in against control decks to potentially blow up your opponent's problematic planeswalkers like Teferi, etc., and the Wandering Emperor. The rest of the deck, mostly Karn targets. Combustible Gear Hulk is potentially a way to kill your opponent or gain some card advantage. It really depends on what your opponent's doing, but in its wake it leaves a 6/6 for striking creature behind, so either way you're getting value. Cityscape Leveler has kind of replaced Meteor Golem as the de facto go get this to blow up your opponent's powerful thing. Obviously a little bit more difficult to cast in a deck without a ton of mana with something like Nykthos in the deck. God Pharaoh Statue, way to kind of close out the game once you kind of established a little bit of a lock with your Karn. Makes it difficult for your opponent to cast spells, so very good against decks like Lotus Field and such, while also putting a clock on with Karn turning it into a creature and its end of turn ability. Sky Sovereign, this is kind of your default thing against a lot of creature-based decks. Very good into decks like Rakdos, Humans, etc. Obviously, some decks kind of make this irrelevant by outsizing it, decks like Angels, but in the early to mid game, this is a great way to keep creature decks in check. Golos, nice way to use your Cascading Cataracts with its ability to activate and play a bunch of spells. But beyond that, also lets you get a little bit further ahead on mana, because sometimes, especially when you don't have the fires, this can be very important to get a little bit of extra mana going. Transmogrifying one, way to destroy your opponent's problematic creatures by leaving them a 2/4 behind. The Stonebrain, primarily here to stop a key card out of your opponent's deck, so decks like Lotus Field, naming Lotus Field, or whatever their way to go grab their WinCon happens to be, etc. Naming Greasefang or Parhelion out of the Greasefang decks. Various decks kind of obviously have a namesake card. Generally, you want to name it with something like the Stonebrain. Damping Sphere, good way to slow down Nykthos and Lotus Field decks. Can also slow down any type of other combo deck, but really, those are the only two that play a bunch of spells anyway, so it kind of serves a purpose in those matchups. Pithing Needle shuts down random nonsensical permanents out of your opponent's deck, whether it be opposing planeswalkers, manlands like Castle Locthwain, or lands like Castle Locthwain, manlands, creatures with activated abilities, etc. Pithing Needle is kind of your go-to when you need to shut down an annoying permanent. Or can even shut down vehicles like Parhelion from being crewed. Draftigger's Cage, never a huge fan of this one. It's supposed to stop graveyard decks, but it doesn't stop the primary graveyard deck in the format with Greasefang. It does help against things like Collected Company and Kaya's Restoration, but this stops creatures from coming back into play, doesn't stop vehicles, so it does help against something like Is It Phoenix, but not the best against something like Abzan Greasefang. Tormod's Crypt, kind of for that, torture your opponent's graveyard for a one-shot. And then Treasure Vault, when you just need access to a land out of your sideboard from your Karn. Maybe you're a little bit short on mana and you need to cast your 5-drops. So let's take a look at some of the other lists. Taking a look at this list is a little bit older than the other version we were taking a look at, as Mono Red frankly doesn't have a whole lot of results, so it is kind of hard to pull recent lists for the deck when the deck doesn't put up a ton of finishes. Obviously, see a lot of the same cards. Some of the utility lands flip around a little bit. This version's running Scavenger Grounds, another way to torch the graveyard a little bit, especially if you happen to be running any Ramonette Ruins or anything. Obviously, this version is not, but does have nice to have access to your land base, having a little bit of utility when you're only playing mono colors anyway. And then full 4 of Field of Ruin paired with your Cleansing Wildfires. Whoever was playing this deck was really in on the LD plan, especially if you're not packing enough basics. One other unique addition to this version is Glorybringer. Now, Glorybringer is a very powerful dragon that kind of gets lost in the shuffle. This was really a centerpiece of the old chunky red decks. It can pressure your opponent and their planeswalkers while also killing their creatures with its exert ability, and is a nice hasty threat to add to your top end when you're trying to get in these kind of battle cruiser magics with decks like blue-white control or other fires decks, potentially things like mono green, etc. It kind of gives you a way to close out the game very quickly, in addition to your Cavalier of Flame draws. Sideboard, this one has a little bit different sideboard, but Lava Coil as removal spells. Just sometimes you need to kill things like the Troll, etc. Very good against other red-based decks, very good against humans, etc. Obviously, these days, these Lava Coils will probably be obliterating bolts, give you a little bit more utility against planeswalkers. Twin Shot Sniper is an interesting channel ability. Allows you to deal with your opponent's smaller creatures, or just cast a 2/3 with reach and kill one of your opponent's creatures. A lot of these bullets are the same. Notable exceptions: Soulguide Lantern over Tormod's Crypt, just as a nice way to torture your opponent's graveyard. Heart of Kiran is a way to protect your other planeswalkers while also threatening to pressure your opponent's life total. Weathered Runestone. Non-land permanents in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. This one's a little bit better than Grafdigger's Cage for the purpose of the format, especially in the presence of Greasefang. If your opponent's able to deal with your Karn, this keeps their vehicles from coming back from the graveyard in addition to creatures. Then the rest of the cards we've already kind of seen, other than Meteor Golem, as we already kind of talked about, has largely been replaced by Cityscape Leveler. Although in mono red in particular, the fact that this deck doesn't generate as much mana as mono green, it might be possible Meteor Golem is still slightly better. Not obviously, the card itself is not better, but from a standpoint of being able to cast it in a more timely, impactful manner. And then, once again, looking at these lists, you see 23 lands along with 3 modal face cards, so a total of 26 lands. This version, you see 23 lands with 2 modal face cards, or sorry, 3 modal face cards. These decks are very mana hungry. One thing I have noticed is there are some lists out there that we're only playing like 21 or 22 lands and like 2 modal face cards. That's just not enough mana for this deck to operate, and you really need to up the mana to like 25 or 26 because you need to reliably cast these spells. And unlike blue decks, you don't tend to have a lot of ways to draw cards or filter cards. Obviously, you have things like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but in the early turns, other than Cleansing Wildfire, you really don't have a lot of cantripping, so you need to be able to hit your land drops naturally. Finally, this version, a little bit different, no Karn in the mix, so I wanted to point it out. Once again, this was a little bit of an older version. You're still seeing a lot of the same cards. You're seeing Sweltering Suns in place of Anger of the Gods in the main deck. The power of Sweltering Suns obviously is the ability to cycle it in matchups where it's kind of useless. But beyond that, you see 2 copies of Strangle along with your Spikefield Hazards to have a little bit of early interaction. This gives you like mana efficient plays to do on turn 1 and turn 2. Say turn 1 you play a land, turn 2 you play a tap land, you can still have some interaction up. Very important in the early turns against the aggressive decks, because if you don't draw your early sweepers, you can easily get overwhelmed by decks like Humans and Spirits. Beyond that, obviously in addition to Thought-Knot Seer, you also have Reality Smasher, which can be a difficult to deal with threat. It's a 5/5 hasty trampler that whenever your opponent's spell targets it, they have to discard a card or it gets countered. You could debate whether this could compete with Glorybringer. I do think Glorybringer is slightly better, even though obviously Glorybringer only hits for 4, this hits for 5, and Glorybringer really doesn't have the downside when you kill it. Reality Smasher is on the ground, so it can get chumped a little bit easier. Has to brawl with things like Mono Green, etc., where Mono Green's only real blocker for something like Glorybringer is things like Cavalier of Thorns, whereas Reality Smasher has to contend with Trolls and everything else. So this card might be a little bit worse, but definitely can see some utility, especially in a format heavy like with Rakdos and stuff, where they have to expend 2 cards to be able to kill it. Land base, nothing real special here, other than 4 copies of Ramunap Ruins. 1 copy of Bonner's Enclave is an interesting one. This allows you to draw cards if you happen to have a creature of power 4 or more in play. It can be very important. Just having utility out of your lands is important in these Fires of Invention decks. And they also have 2 copies of Valakut Awakening, cards that I have not talked about yet, but this is another way to have a land in addition to a spell that allows you to kind of shuffle some useless cards back into your deck and draw some fresh cards and hopefully get a little bit of momentum going if you happen to flood out or just get stuck with no action stuck in your hand. Sideboard, this one actually has a sideboard as opposed to a card and wish board. 3 copies of Unlicensed Hearse. Graveyard Hate, good place to be, especially with Phoenix and Greasefang floating around. Damping Sphere, obviously this deck seems a little bit weak, the lowest field, although you do have the Cleansing Wildfires and Field of Ruins to kind of disrupt them a little bit. Never bad to have these just as a way to slow them down, as you don't have a very fast clock, and lowest field is just a little bit faster than you. Red Cap Melee, primarily here for red-based decks, good against mono red, good against Rakdos, etc. These could easily be replaced by Chandra's Defeat or something if you're specifically worried about red-based decks. The plus side of these ones is you can target non-red creatures, but obviously with the downside of sacking a land. Fry, Greasefang, Angels, Spirits, nothing new there. Anger of the Gods, we've already kind of talked about. Lava Coil, once again, this is a little bit older list, should probably be Obliterating Bolts. And then, with obviously the plus side of they both exile, Obliterating Bolt just a little bit better because it happens to target Planeswalkers as well. And then Scrap Clan Berserker, interesting one. This is a way to attack decks like decks like Lotus Field Combo, Blue-White Control, etc. Decks that are trying to cast a bunch of non-creature spells. This is a 2/2 with haste that whenever it damages your opponent, suddenly every non-creature spell they cast is dealing them 2 damage. Could argue something like Eidolon might be a little bit better in some of those style of matchups, but Scrap Clan Berserker kind of fits the bill as a powerful 3-drop that your opponent will have to deal with before dealing with your 4 and 5 drops, so I can easily see why this would come in. And Eidolon obviously would damage you a little bit in some of those situations. As far as the deck's placement in the format, when the deck kind of burst on the scene, it was a little bit of an unknown quantity. It did well in some good pilot's hands, things like Expiring Spike, things like Doomwake, but the deck has noticeably fallen off. And some of the playing I've done with it, I've noticed one huge thing is you definitely need a lot of land drops. The first list that I looked at only had, I think it was 21 lands and 2 middle face cards, and I upped that to 22 lands and 2 middle face cards, and it still always felt like I was getting stuck on mana. Another thing is you need to maximize your Darksteel Citadels and Cascading Cataracts. One of the powers of this deck is the hands where you have the Indestructible Land and Cleansing Wildfire, being able to go from 2 mana to 4 mana on turn 3. Very important for a deck as clunky and slow as this deck overall. Also, as I've kind of mentioned just now, deck is slow and clunky. If you don't have these busted opening draws of Cleansing Wildfire and such, you're just trying to hold on until you can drop your Fires of Invention. You have to be able to hit your land drops. You have to have Fires of Invention to really take advantage of this, or Chandra, just to be able to get ahead on mana. Much like other Fires decks, you can play a conventional game of Magic, but you are much better when you have Fires of Invention in play. This deck is very much a board presence deck, so you're good against a lot of the decks where board presence is relevant. Decks like Humans, decks like Mono Red Aggro, decks like Rakdos Midrange, even to an extent Mono Green, although that matchup can be a struggle. You do have tools, especially if you have a lot of red removal in your sideboard, to go kill your Mana Door, Cleansing Wildfire, your Enchanted Land, kind of go from there. Then you're kind of battling them on a bit more par. And you have a number of haste creatures in your deck with the ability to pressure their planeswalkers, especially if you're on the Glorybringer build, or having access to Karn Wishboard to deal with your opponent's stuff. Beyond that, if you're a board presence deck, this deck's generally pretty good against that. Where it struggles, decks with a bunch of counterspells. Blue-White Control, decks like Spirits, decks like Angels that grow out of range of the removal very quickly. So anything where red-based removal is typically weak, this deck can struggle with. So decks with big dumb idiot monsters like Mono Green, aggro as opposed to Mono Green Devotion. Decks like Mono Blue Spirits, decks like Blue-White Spirits, decks like Angels, decks like Blue-White Control are all a bit of nightmarish matchups. And like many other Fires decks, it does lose to itself quite a bit. If you don't have the specific draw of Fires of Invention itself, or some way to get ahead on mana, you're just kind of a clunky red Midrange deck, and you're like a worse version of Chunky Red that obviously fell off. So it's kind of where the deck's positioned in the meta. It is a fun deck to play when it does its thing, but it does have a fail rate, so sometimes it struggles. And obviously, decks like Lotus Field Combo you have to have your good draws. Cleansing Wildfire, Field of Ruin definitely help in that matchup, but it's a close matchup speed-wise. So, things you should be aware of. The deck is decent, especially if you get the land mix right. But beyond that, it's definitely not the best version of Fires. Enigmatic Incarnation and Karuga Fires are definitely better. And I would even say the Transmogrify Agent of Treachery version is probably just a tiny bit better than this as far as executing its strategy. So, but it is a twist on things. You can definitely catch opponents off guard with Cleansing Wildfires and Field of Ruins. You know, some of these decks are running a little bit low on basics, especially these 4 and 5 color Leyline Binding Fires decks can be a little bit light on, especially if they're not running Omnath with Fable. Not Fable, yeah, whatchamacallit. I'm going to draw a blank on that one. But they're not running Omnath. Generally, they're not running a bunch of basics. So, you know, you might be able to get them and disrupt their mana just that tiny little bit. So, as always, if you like these kind of deck overviews, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hope to see you for the next video.